Welcome to another exciting episode of Value-Based Voices, a podcast from the Association for Value-Based Cancer Care. Each episode dives into the shifting terrain of cancer care in the United States, exploring what value means in today's clinical, policy, and patient-centered environments. Our mission is to spark informed dialogue, promote transparency, and equip every stakeholder from providers to payers to patients with the insight they need to navigate cancer care with clarity, confidence, and purpose. My name is Jayson Slotnik, a partner with Health Policy Strategies and an AVBCC board member, and I'll be your host for this exciting episode. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Usdin, Senior Editor of BioCentury Publications and author of the book's Bureau of Spies and Engineering Communism. Welcome, Steve, to our first part one of our podcast. We'll be talking a lot about what has happened to the FDA in the last couple of months and what are the political implications of those activities. And we'll talk a little bit about the future and who's going to be the new FDA commissioner. So, Steve, take it away.
Yeah, well, Jayson, thanks. It is fun to do this in front of an audience now. We've been having these conversations for 25 years, mostly over carbonated and non-carbonated beverages, and so thanks a lot. I'm the Washington editor of BioCentury. I've been covering what I like to think of as really how public policy makes it either easier or harder to turn science into medicine. That's what I think of as my beat. FDA is a huge focus, and it has been for all these years. So what's been happening? So, really, it's been like standing in front of a fire hose, right? Anybody that's been following FDA since January 2025. And the thing is, that I think there's a tendency, because there's so much happening, to kind of forget about some of the early things that happened. But that's a mistake, because the things that happened in the very first months of the Trump administration created so much change, most of it negative, that the effects of it are still being felt now, and they will be, I think, even for a generation. It was an inflection point, a generational inflection point. When the DOJ started making cuts at FDA, the effect on FDA staff and on FDA morale was horrific. Morale went down the toilet. There were huge numbers of people who were fired. There were incidents, where people showed up at the office and hundreds of them found out that they'd been fired because their IDs didn't work anymore and they couldn't get in the building, and then they were escorted to their desks, and then they were, escorted out with their stuff, treated like criminals. You had the HHS Secretary Kennedy come to FDA and accuse the FDA staff of being sock puppets of industry. And the effects on the morale were enormous. You had not only were large numbers of people fired, but large numbers of people also looked for the exits, right? Yeah. And then you had this churn, so many different CDER directors and acting CDER directors. You had Vinay Prasad as CBER director, and then he wasn't CBER director, and then he was CBER director, and then he wasn't CBER director. All of those things have had enormous impacts on FDA. And then you had very obvious political and ideological interference in FDA's activities across a wide spectrum of activities, the most obvious being vaccines, but it was also in therapeutic products and tobacco and food and other things. And that also had as an effect not only just on the products that were involved in the subject to kind of political or ideological interference, but again in eroding public confidence and industry's confidence in the agency, and eroding morale at the agency. So, Marty Makari's out, Vinay Prasad is out, Tracy Beth Hoeg is out. We can talk about those things. And there is an effort now to reset, to try to get back to something that's more like normal. But you can't say that the effects of all of that turmoil can just be turned off with a switch. It can't. And one of the reasons is because there's so much expertise, so much institutional memory that walked out the door. And that's not to say that everybody who's left isn't competent. There are a lot of good, competent people who are left, but there's a lot of expertise and there's a lot of knowledge that walked out the door that just isn't there now, and people can't draw on that.
So, Steve, thinking about loss of confidence, you mentioned a couple of different stakeholders, right? The community, probably the manufacturers. But one area I want to pick up on, what BioCentury does such a good job on, is connecting the investor community to the policy world, like you said, what your beat is. So I'm sure confidence was shaken in the investor community. Are you seeing any rebound on confidence on the investment? Because without private investment, right, we've got that funnel dries up, and then we'll get into the manufacturer, and then we'll get into the political side of this. But in terms of bringing back confidence, are we there yet with the investment community?
We're not 100% there. I talk to a lot of VCs. What I'm hearing is, so far so good. People feel better about what's happening, but I think people are reserving judgment. They're reserving judgment both because of what I talked about the loss of expertise at the agency, but also because there's still continuing signs of political interference and ideology at FDA. For example, there's an advisory committee meeting coming up soon to talk about creating a more permissive environment for bulk compounding of peptides. And that doesn't have a direct commercial impact on biopharma companies, but it's indicative of an ideological kind of anti-science approach at kind of governing what happens with the regulatory environment. That advisory committee has been packed with people who, quite honestly, appear to have conflicts of interest in favor of allowing bulk compounding of these peptides that haven't been tested, that nobody knows what they do, and the HHS Secretary Kennedy has said that he's a big fan of them and he wants to have, just let them loose, let people have access to them. So I think that, that's one sign. There are other signs that there's still continuing influence from ideology and from politics on regulatory decisions. It's not nearly like it was under McCary. And I think there's also, it's kind of a double-edged sword. There's a feeling of relief that a lot of the products that they had unexpected setbacks under McCary and under Prasad, FDA's taken another look at them, right? And it looks like a lot of them are on a track where they may end up getting approved. On the one hand, that's good. I think people feel like it's good because people feel like a lot of the setbacks weren't justified. I think that there's still people who are wary and should be wary about the process by which that reversal happened. Are they giving these things the kind of scrutiny, and most importantly, are they doing it in a way that's publicly defensible and transparent so people have confidence in the system going forward, that it's not just, okay, well, these things got setbacks and it was a kind of arbitrary and politically motivated, ideologically motivated process, and now all of a sudden a similar political or ideological movement says, oh, okay, now we're just going to sweep away everything and approve those things. It has to be done in a way that gives people confidence that the system's working the way that it is supposed to.
Do you have confidence that we have reached that balancing where the system is working, like you said, like it's supposed to? Or are you still skeptical that while these products are coming back, the cynical Washingtonian in us could say they're coming back as a show, but they're just going to be denied again, and we'll hear about the political meddling 2-3 years from now?
I think most of those products are going to end up getting approved. I do still have some, reservations. I think the jury's still out on what's happening at FDA, and it will be until we get a new commissioner, right? Because the acting commissioner, Kyle Diamantis, has made it pretty clear externally and internally that he wants to do things, in the way that FDA traditionally has done them. That career staff will be making decisions, again, but there are exceptions. The compounding, bulk compounding of the peptides is one exception. But generally speaking, he's made it pretty clear that he's going to go back to kind of like a normal order of business, right? But he's an acting commissioner. He doesn't seem to be in the running to become permanent commissioner. So the real question is going to be who's the next permanent commissioner, and what's their stance, and quite honestly, how much longer is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. the HHS Secretary, and how much authority, as long as he's there, is he going to have over what's happening at FDA?
So before we get to the next commissioner and Kennedy's tenure, how is morale now at the agency with those career staff that are still there? Do you think it's stabilized? Do you still think there are people looking for the door? FDA's announced they want to hire. Do you think they'll be able to attract talent? Have we reached the stabilization point, at least on the career side, where we have confidence that there is a career adult in the room, if you will, overseeing the process that at least gets us that level of confidence before it hits the political appointee level of approval?
It's a mixed bag there too. Okay, so what I'm hearing is that for the most part, for most things, career staff are making the decisions, and there isn't interference from the Office of the Commissioner. The Senate directors aren't, putting their thumbs on the scale. On the other hand, there is a continuing loss of morale. People still are looking for the exits, and the people who are there are very concerned about the situation. Part of it is because they don't have confirmed leadership, right? And so people are looking at, and they're making decisions, and they kind of have one eye over their shoulders, and they're thinking, am I making a decision that's going to imperil my career? Because whoever comes in next as the Senate director or as the FDA commissioner or in other places is going to look at something that I've done now, and it's going to be detrimental to me. And there's just a lack of direction that is affecting morale. But I shouldn't say that's universal, because there are things that FDA is doing that, and we can talk about it. Operation Trailblazer is a good example of it. Things where they seem to be making real progress under this kind of interim leadership. So it's a mixed bag. I'd like to be able to say it's black and white one way or the other, but it isn't.
All right, so let's go back before we get to what FDA is doing. Let's finish our conversation about, so who do you think is going to be the next commissioner? When do you think that'll occur? And more importantly, to some extent, for our audience, what should we be watching for as an indication as to A, who's going to be selected, and B, under the time frame? I don't think we're going to get one until after the election. I could be wrong, but what do you think?
So I don't think we're going to have a confirmed commissioner until after the election, and my guess is I don't think we'll have one until we have a new Congress. And that's just math, because there just aren't that many days for the Senate free on the Senate calendar between now and the end of the year when we get a new Congress, and there are a lot of different nominations, public health nominations included, that they have to get through before they would get to a commissioner. What I'm hearing, and that actually surprises me, so I'm hearing persistently from people who are in touch with people in the White House that they intend to name the new FDA commissioner relatively soon. I think that's it's a perilous strategy, really, because if you name somebody now, but they're not actually going to be able to go through the confirmation process until next year, they're going to be twisting out there in the wind, and everybody's going to be finding ways to dig up things about them that they don't like, and criticisms and so on like that. So, I would think it's a high risk political strategy for them to do it. I keep hearing that they're going to do it. As to who it's going to be and what to look for, so the persistent rumors are that there are three people who are being considered: Heidi Overton, Jeffrey Vaserka, and Stephen Ferrara. It's possible that somebody else will surface, or that somebody else is being considered, and their name hasn't leaked out yet. But those are the names that we've heard. All of them have medical degrees, but other than that, they lack the credentials that have previously been considered essential for leading FDA. They don't have deep regulatory expertise, they don't have experience running large organizations, and they don't have public health experience. What I'm told is that Chris Klomp, who's the nominee for deputy secretary of HHS, and who's the counselor to the HHS Secretary now, and is essentially for all practical purposes, running running HHS on a day-to-day basis. So what I've heard is that his plan is to have a nominee for FDA commissioner who's, like I said, kind of a non-traditional nominee who would be outward-facing, and then to put staff in around them. Maybe a deputy commissioner who'd be in charge of medical products, and permanent center directors, either the ones who are there now or different ones, and that they would make up for whatever lack of experience the commissioner would have by having this kind of team around them. We can talk about that. I think that's also a high-risk strategy. As for the people who have been named, the real concern, the real thing that people, I think, will want to look at is whether they're people who are committed to an independent, science-based regulatory system, or whether they will continue the kind of political and ideological influence that was the hallmark of McCarry's tenure as commissioner. Of the people who have been named, of those three, I don't personally know any of them. I've personally known most of the FDA commissioners going back for 30 years, but I don't know any of these three. But of course, I've looked into their backgrounds. The one who I think would give people the most pause would be Heidi Overton, right. And it's because she's closely identified with Marty McCary. She worked with him at Hopkins, and because she's been very identified with the MAHA, the Make America Healthy Again movement, and she's also been politically outspoken, and she works in the White House now. So having somebody go from the White House to leadership of FDA would give people pause. They would think that, it'd be likely that she would be a kind of conduit for political influence over the FDA. The way I look at it is you have to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. So you can have those concerns, but then you have to see if she gets the job, whether that was really the case.
But like you said before, she's not going to be the leader in the clubhouse that restores all the confidence to all the different stakeholders that the industry needs. Who do you think would be able to do that?
I don't know if she could do that or not. I think it's a question that she would have going in if she gets it. I would point out there are people who have gone into this job and people who people have had their reservations about and who have stepped up and done great jobs. So the most obvious example of that is Scott Gottlieb. When he went in, there was a lot of concern. He had ties to industry. He'd been considered kind of a conservative political commentator and so on like that. And you know what? It turned out, I think most people would agree that he was one of the most effective FDA commissioners. And when he left, he had bipartisan support. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility that somebody who you'd have doubts about coming in and doing an excellent job and kind of proving the doubters wrong. But any one of these three, if they get the job, they're going to go in with those doubts, and they're going to have to overcome skepticism.
Yeah, personally, I would like to see them go back and ask Dr. Marks if he would be interested in doing it, or get a career staffer to instill confidence. That would probably be the best way to go. But
I think it's very unlikely because, look, the hallmark of the Trump administration is putting loyalists in charge of these kinds of jobs. I don't think that Peter Marks or pretty much anybody who's had a deep experience at the agency is going to give the White House that sense of confidence that they're going to be loyal to the president in the way that this president expects.
So speaking of loyalty, right? We have the election coming up in a short period of time. You and I discussed a friendly wager as to how long the secretary will be there post-election. I am in the camp that I don't think he will be there much past the election. What are your thoughts?
I agree with you, and I know it has to be true that he's not going to stay there long, because I predicted in writing in January that he wasn't going to last much longer than the midterm elections, and I hate to be wrong. So I think that he won't last long. They're keeping him there now in large measure, I believe, because they believe that he can deliver a certain measure of the vote for the midterm elections, and they certainly don't want to antagonize the following that he has. It isn't huge, but the margins between victory and defeat in many of the midterm elections will be very small. It will depend on both sides turning out their base. And the White House and the Republican establishment certainly doesn't want to have Maha voters staying at home, right? So I think they're going to keep him certainly until then. After that, all bets are off. I don't think that there's a sense in the White House that he's run HHS effectively. He's caused a lot of headaches for them. His anti-vaccine stance is not popular in the country, and I think he's not likely to stay much longer. But I do think that they won't want him as an adversary. So the most likely scenario, I think, is to try to find some kind of gentle way for him to move on to something else. And I would think it would be after the midterm elections, and who knows if it's weeks or months, but I think that's what's going to happen. You know what? I'll just jump in with one other prediction. There's a very good chance, I think, that Mehmet Oz would be named HHS Secretary if Kennedy were to leave. In contrast to Kennedy, he has done a very effective job at running CMS. There are people, I'm sure, maybe you, I don't know, you know more about CMS than I do for sure. But whether you agree with or disagree with everything he's done, he's taken the job very seriously and surprised a lot of people by that. And he's also been really outspoken in demonstrating his loyalty to Trump, which is, as I mentioned earlier, is a prerequisite for getting that job.
And unlike Kennedy, knows the difference between Medicare and Medicaid, and when he testified, and is a much more personable and outgoing and sort of media for obvious reasons. So, yes, I've heard that Dr. Oz is on the very short list to be secretary, but that then you leave a vacancy at CMS. So, I mean, like you said, there's a lot of political back and forth on this. But what has gone right at the FDA, Steve? Let's give some optimism to our audience. You mentioned a couple of initiatives a few minutes ago. Let's take a deeper dive. What is going on at the FDA that should give patients and providers some confidence, some optimism about the future? The next generation of drugs is actually going to be approved and accessible for patients.
So there are several grounds for optimism. One of them is that one of the first things that the acting FDA Commissioner Kyle Diamandis did when he got the position was to hold a meeting with rare disease patient advocates. There was a big group of rare disease patient advocates who came in. Amy Ricks, who runs the Rare Disease Hub, facilitated the meeting. And I spoke with, it was an off-the-record meeting, but obviously they knew that bringing all those people in was going to, the people were going to talk about it. And they did, and everybody came out of it favorably impressed. They said he was a good listener, that FDA seemed to be on board with understanding the nuances and the differences between regulating drugs for rare diseases, especially very ultra-rare diseases and more common diseases. And they felt that they hadn't been heard, and that there had been real conflict between that community and FDA under McCarran and Prasad. Another thing I think, bigger is this Operation Trailblazer that I mentioned. It's a whole package of initiatives that are supposed to close the gap between the United States and China in terms of phase 1 first-in-human trials. And they're rolling it out. First thing is that they put together, it's a very well thought out plan. A lot of the things that are in there are things that other groups, the Reagan-Udall Foundation, Duke Margolis Center, Representative Auchincloss, who's also working on this, all of them have kind of converged around similar sets of ideas. And so the ideas that are in Operation Trailblazer are ones that there's a broad support for. It was rolled out in a normal way. It wasn't like McCarran was doing, where he announced these things on a podcast or a social media post. They rolled it out. They're asking for comment. They're soliciting ideas from the community. I think the deadline for commenting is Monday, and so that, I think that one, they're focusing on the right problem, right? Yeah. The problem that it has become for a variety of reasons. We can talk about it if you want. It's become far too difficult to launch first in human trials in the United States, especially compared to China, Australia, the UK, and other places. And the things that they want to do, in my opinion, are incremental. They're not as bold or transformative as I would like to see, but they're really excellent first steps, and they're for the most part completely non-controversial.
That wraps up this episode of Value-Based Voices, brought to you by the Association for Value-Based Cancer Care. Thank you very much, Steve, for sharing your insights on what has occurred at the FDA over the last 18 months and the political implications of those activities and what does it mean for drug discovery. And to our listeners for joining the conversation. But wait, that was only part one. There is a part two, and hope you guys join us for the second part of this, my conversation with Steve. And so if you found today's discussion thought-provoking, I plan on seeing you at the second part two of our discussion with Steve. And more generally, please be sure to subscribe to Value-Based Voices wherever you get your podcasts. Stay tuned for more general episodes that spotlight the voices shaping the future of oncology.